Hello and welcome to another edition of our Defend Democracy webinars. My name is Olaf Böhnke and I'm a senior advisor to the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity and the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. We host this webinar in partnership with the Canadian Embassy in Denmark, and our talk today is supposed to be the opening act for the second Global Conference for Media Freedom, which will be co-hosted by the governments of Canada and Botswana next Monday, November 16th. This online event today will feature, the online event on the 16th will feature the first ministerial meeting of the Media Freedom Coalition, a group of 37 governments committed to working together to advocate for media freedom and the protection of journalists. So don't forget to bookmark next Monday in your calendars. All the details can be found if you follow the link which was included in your invitation to our web talk today, or you just Google for a Global Conference for Media Freedom, which takes place next Monday. Just a very short housekeeping instruction. You are more than welcome to ask questions at any time throughout the entire discussion. Those of you who registered beforehand and are joining us for the Zoom conference room, please use the Q&A chat box. Everyone else following us on our social media streams, please use the comment box and we will make sure that we have an eye on it too. I will then bring forward your questions to the panel later during the debate. And before I give the floor now to our distinguished moderator, Allan, who's a former Canadian minister and a member of our Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity, let me kick off the debate by a quick poll, which might give us some useful background information about the habits and of our audience today. Unfortunately, due to our technical limitations, only those in the Zoom room can attend the call, but here it is. So our question is, what platform do you use the most for getting your daily news? Is it social media platforms? Is it news websites, TV or radio news? Do you get it from print media or from podcasts? So you have now a couple of seconds to click one of your preferred boxes. And here are the results. So the winner are news websites. So 67% of our audience in the Zoom room prefers news website, followed by social media platforms and print media with 40%, 20% still listen to radio and look TV news, and 7% prefer their information from podcasts. 20 people in total attended this poll, so we're not representative at this stage, but still gives us, I think, some interesting information. We have a second one for you, which comes up in a second, and here we are. How much of your everyday news do you get via social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram? And this includes also individual posts as well as forwarded articles from any kind of news outlets. Is it 25%, up to 50%? Is it up to 75% or maybe 100? 25% of our audience 60% of our audience are using social media platforms by 25%. It's another 20% who use it half of their consumption, and no one actually gets their news from 100% from social media, 13% still. 75% of their news coverage comes from social media. So that's, I think, is an interesting start. And without further ado, I give the floor now to Allan.
Thank you, Olaf. I mean, I say what a pleasure it is for me to be part of this important discussion today. I'm grateful to be here. And it's a challenge, I think, that is well worth discussing. After all, democracy itself fundamentally rests on a well-informed electorate. Ideally, the electorate derives its information from robust and independent media outlets, both online and off. Ideally, those independent media are there to support accountability, transparency, and participation in democratic processes. That's how we facilitate informed public debate, hold the powerful to account, and protect the public interest. But the basic assumptions underlying that traditional sort of analog information ecosystem are being questioned in the digital age, and even more so in the so-called post-factual age in which we're now living. I learned on the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity and the work I did with the commission that disinformation challenges government, social media, and journalists alike. But the approaches of those three different groups on how to deal with the threat of disinformation sometimes tend to be very different. And today we want to focus on the perspective of journalists in dealing with disinformation. And we've assembled for that purpose a remarkable panel of exceptional speakers, each of whom has vast experience in the field of journalism, and each of whom have confronted this challenge in their own way, some with very specific tools that they've made available to their profession. I'll introduce all four now very briefly in the order in which they will speak, and I start with Lisbeth Knudsen. Lisbeth is the editor-in-chief of Mandag Morgen, or Monday Morning, a digital and print magazine. She's one of Denmark's best known and most highly respected journalists. She'll provide us with insight on how the global wave of disinformation impacts her in her job today. And she'll also introduce a very innovative fact-checking service which her publication offers to its readers. Chine Labbe is the managing editor for NewsGuard. Chine is a reporter, writer, and podcast host. She worked for 6 years as a journalist for Reuters in Paris, as well as for The Economist in New York. NewsGuard, her current employer, is an organization that publishes trust ratings for the news sites that account for 95% of all online news engagements. How that works, she will share with us in a few moments. Craig Silverman is media editor of Buzzfeed News, based in Toronto, here in Canada. Craig is an author and journalist, one of the world's leading experts on the subjects we're discussing today: online misinformation, fake news, and the attention economy. Craig previously worked as a reporter for the Globe and Mail, for the Toronto Star, and for Columbia Journalism Review. He also edited the Verification Handbook, which equips journalists with tools they need to evaluate the reliability of sources. Our fourth speaker is Janine Zacharia, a lecturer at Stanford University, a former correspondent for the Washington Post, Bloomberg News, and the Jerusalem Post. Together with her Stanford colleague, Andrew Grotto, Janine published earlier this year 10 guidelines for media on how to report on hacked information, disinformation, and all forms of propaganda. But their work is not simply theoretical. They have released, along with their study, a flow chart for reporters and editors to follow for the implementation of their 10 guidelines. And of course, we're eager to learn what response she's had from newsrooms who have worked with those guidelines. After the presentation of our four speakers, I will ask a few questions of my own as the chair's prerogative, and then we'll get to your questions. As Olaf has mentioned, you should use the chat line or the Q&A or comment function and try to address your question to a specific panelist if you could. Let's begin then with Lisbeth Knudsen, and I invite you now, Lisbeth, to make your presentation.
Thank you very much, Allan, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this very interesting panel. A free and open democracy in any state depends on independent and professional media. I represent the legacy media, you could say, and a very traditional journalist. We are, as I like to call it, a basic supply chain for a healthy democracy. Let me start by pointing out some of the big challenges for professional legacy media today. The definition of media actors has expanded enormously as a result of many new forms of media on the internet, and as a result of the easy access to publishing for all people, all interest groups, all companies, organizations, all advocacy media, and conspiracy channels as well. This means that people do no longer distinguish in the same way as they did before between classic independent professional media and journalism and all the other stuff, some of it of dubious quality, some of it propaganda, some of it lobbyism. It gets all mixed up in a crowded news feed on our mobile phones, where it is less clear where all the stuff comes from, and where the original source sometimes disappears. Much of the dubious content is disguised as editorial news when it is in fact disinformation, fake news, alternative facts, or fake videos. This dark side of the globalized information reality is a fundamental threat to the credibility of the legacy media and eventually to democracy itself. Our real problem is trust. Our political institutions and the media supporting democracy are fragile and open to attacks and manipulation coming from unfriendly algorithms, trolls and bots, conspiracy groups, and people who want to destabilize our democracy. With artificial intelligence and manipulation of live and still images, lies, disinformation, and propaganda are being taken to a new level. Fake videos may appear so convincingly now that it is becoming difficult to distinguish between fact and fiction. The cure, in my opinion, is not just to make a stronger regulation of the tech giants. We see now what is happening when Facebook and Twitter try to be much more alert, handling lies and alternative facts on their platforms during the American election campaign. Now we see a new social platform called Parler, organized for the right-wing people, and where there is no restrictions on publishing, anything goes. So fighting fakes, lies, and propaganda is therefore not only an important case for legacy media and professional media, it's a case for all of us. And citizens need tools to debunk the stories and videos that they see and share. There needs to be a more enlightened and critical public understanding of the processes on the internet. Professional media should, of course, make a clear difference, and journalists, professional journalists, need to step up. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it's a matter of the media not becoming part of the elite and representing the people better. It's about unbiased and fair reporting. When people label fake news, sometimes they don't mean fake news, they mean biased news, and they mean poor reporting. So we need to step up. The last 4 or 5 years, there has been a growing new kind of media, independent fact checkers whose business is not to make news in a classical sense, but to fact check news. We have now that kind of independent fact checkers in all of the Nordic countries. In Denmark, we have check.dk, translated to English, meaning check it. We started the initiative in 2016 without really knowing that we were soon to become a member of a very impressive club of high standard quality fact checkers all around the world. We are all members of the International Fact Checking Network. I think there are about 100 now or more fact checkers around the world. We have signed up to a very strong ethical standards. Our activity must pass an independent quality test every year. And these strong ethical standards mean a lot of documentation, meaning openness about the sources we use and things like that. I want to stress that this year, where the coronavirus has meant a lot more of fake news, the IFCN, as it's called, this network, brought together fact checkers from across the world to form a hashtag Coronavirus Fact Alliance. And we created a searchable database for corona fact checks, now with over 9,000 submissions, so far coming from 70 countries. We see that the coronavirus fake news spread all over the world, and it's some of the same stories walking from one country to the next one. It is an open access database, so you could take a look, all of you. And let me finalize here my short presentation with an update on what we see in Denmark going on right now. We see a growing number of so-called underground media outlets that try to influence and manipulate the public debate by sending lots of the same postulates and undocumented statements to popular platforms. We see people gather in very aggressive groups like anti-vaccine groups, anti-5G groups, all kinds of groups protesting against COVID-19 restrictions, against political regulation of the internet, claiming that it is an attack on our freedom of expressions. And this last year, we have seen some of these groups making very serious verbal attacks on media and fact checkers, proclaiming that we have just become part of the deep state and an elite hijacking our democracy. So the debate on the internet has lost much of its bright side, the sense of freedom of expression and cross-border sharing information, and unfortunately has also become a threat to both democratic values and trust in professional media. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisbeth. May I invite Chine now to make her presentation? Chine?
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me today for this important conversation. So you asked us to start by laying out what we consider to be the key challenges that journalists of traditional media face. From where I stand, I think there are three main challenges. The first one, and the most important one in my opinion, is how to quickly and efficiently identify new sources of information in an ecosystem that, as Lisbeth has pointed out, has fundamentally changed in that there is a myriad of new emerging actors that emerge every day, breaking out stories, being shared on social media, and quite frankly, it's hard to keep track of all these new sources of information and hard to discriminate between the players that are responsible players and the one that might have a hidden agenda, hidden funding, etc. We've seen it a lot in recent months in the US in the lead up to the presidential elections. We've seen a lot of partisan websites funded by political PACs posing as local media when they're really propaganda machines. In the US and in Europe, we've seen websites hiding their links to foreign states. Recently, the US State Department seized 92 websites that were spreading Iranian disinformation and acting for Iran. At NewsGuard, the company for which I work, in July, we published an analysis of a French language website that was spreading Russian propaganda and that was hiding its relationship to a unit of the Russian military intelligence. So navigating this ecosystem, knowing which sources to cite, which ones to be wary of, even when politicians are citing them, can be really tricky. And more, it's important to note that disinformation campaigns are not about spreading outright lies. They're about instilling doubt in people and making them question facts and question what's true and what's not. So of course, it's become much harder in that state to flag the actors that are leading these campaigns. The second related challenge is the risk of missing part of the conversation and to focus on the wrong beats for journalists. In an online world that's basically governed by secret algorithms that feed people with different insights, different news, different recommendations, and it's people are more and more closed off in their own informational bubble, and that includes journalists. And so it's easy to quickly lose track of what's being shared, what's being read, until it's already too late in a way, until it's part of the mainstream. Finally, the last challenge I'd say for journalists today is responding to the speed at which disinformation is spreading without compromising their own journalistic rigor. So what can be done? To me and to the company I'm representing here today, NewsGuard, the priority is really media literacy. Providing readers, internet users, and journalists who are lacking financial capacity and time with appropriate and timely information on the sources that are circulating online. So instead of focusing so much on fact-checking, which of course is important, add to our toolkit what we call pre-bunking, and which is a term that actually, interestingly, Twitter has started using recently as well. The idea that we need to give preventive alerts on dubious sources of information to enlighten readers before they share hoaxes, and also before the hoax is even being published and spread. Of course, more transparency from the platforms would help on the algorithms that they use to recommend content and to make some contents more viral than others. I think one interesting venture in that regard is what something that the Markup announced recently with the Citizen Browser project, by which they plan to try and audit algorithms. But at the risk of repeating myself, I really think that it all comes down to media literacy and education, because even if the platform are being more really regulated, even as they enforce new, stricter moderation rules, which they have, and we've seen it with QAnon content, we've seen it during the US election campaign, the disinformation, as Lisbeth also was pointing, is spreading elsewhere on messaging apps like WhatsApp or WeChat, on where there is no oversight, on new fringer platforms like Gab or Parler, where journalists are even more in the dark. So a crucial part of solving that puzzle will be to provide more context to reader and journalist. And that's what we do at NewsGuard through a browser extension that gives you a quick visual warning of the credibility of the source you're about to read, with a red icon for unreliable websites, with the idea that it's gonna help you maybe pause and hopefully think twice before you share some content from a source that has proven unreliable in the past. And several studies have shown that it works. Media literacy messages are effective in reducing engagement with disinformation online. So I'd also like to add that we need to forcefully defend facts, to patiently reestablish the truth when we encounter misinformation. And I don't think this should be only done by fact checkers. All journalists should seize that. We can't accept that facts are being debated continuously. That's not what democracy is about. But of course, and Lisbeth also pointed that in her presentation, to do that and to do that efficiently, journalists need to be trusted. And unfortunately, it's not the case today. Northern European countries like Denmark are doing pretty well in that regard, but in the rest of Europe, and especially in France, where I'm from, the picture is not so great. In France, the trust in media is at an all-time low with this pandemic, with 21% of people trusting the media. So journalists need to work on restoring that trust. And again, it all comes down to being more transparent.
Thank you, Chine. May I invite Craig Silverman to make his presentation? Craig?
Thank you. Well, I think Chine and Lisbeth gave a lot of really great overview of the challenges of this media environment that has so many different sources masquerading as trustworthy and not, government actors masquerading as news outlets, scammers masquerading as news outlets, and I think that these are signals of kind of the larger challenge that we're all dealing with, not only in the sense of journalism, but in navigating this really chaotic digital environment, which is that, so many more voices can be part of the conversation, which is absolutely a good thing, and very much connected to the idea of freedom of speech and democracy and those fundamental ideas that we all support and hold dear. At the same time, what happens is that when you have a much more open environment where anyone can participate, where anonymity or pseudonymity or the ability to conceal who you are and your real origins opens the door to massive amounts of manipulation. And so we see that represented in the media world in terms of sort of sites that pretend to be news outlets that maybe are run by a government, or sites that pretend to be news outlets that are run by a financially driven actor. And we see it in people who sell products on Amazon and pay for fake or sponsored reviews. We see it in the economy around fake likes and engagement to help content spread faster on algorithmically driven platforms. And so we have this extremely different and challenging information environment that has, of course, benefits, but also opens the door to massive manipulation and masquerading as something that you're not. And so this, for newsrooms, is a challenge not just in terms of distinguishing the work that we do from the pretenders and others, but also in terms of investigating and exposing this stuff in the environment and ensuring that in our work, we aren't tricked by, someone pretending to be something they're not, or a website pretending to be something that it's not. And, for me, after spending, I don't know, I guess it's been a decade or more doing training in newsrooms around accuracy and verification, examining and researching, the way information flows in this media environment. One of the big challenges is that newsrooms and journalists are not equipped with the skills and tools and resources to actually dig into this stuff and understand how to do it. And the explosion in fact checking has been great, because to be a fact checker in this environment, you need to adopt a lot of these approaches and tools and resources. But it's still surprising to me the extent to which in newsrooms, journalists are not grounded in some of the fundamental approaches for looking at this stuff. And I think one of the challenges we have is that it's still seen as a niche area for fact checkers or digital investigators, when the reality is that every single journalist on every single beat needs to understand these truths about the environment we're operating in, and how much journalists are targeted on every single beat with these kinds of campaigns, with these kinds of approaches. We now have a global disinformation for hire industry where PR firms, marketing firms are actually, standardizing these kinds of things of, inauthentic activity, fake accounts, ways of exploiting the digital environment. And they, of course, if they can get that information laundered through credible and established media, then the information they're putting out there takes on that much more credibility. And at the same time, it can have the effect of, once it's revealed, undermining the credibility of traditional media, or more traditional, or even more for new actors to kind of muddy the waters. And so I think we have this massive challenge, and it manifests itself in so many different ways, as I say, from like e-commerce scams, but also the rise of private messaging, whether it's WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger or the different apps that are popular in different parts of the world. We can do a lot of research around Facebook and other platforms, even though they're not as open as we'd like them to be. But when it comes to WhatsApp and other places that are private and encrypted, if you aren't in the group, if you aren't getting the message, you have no idea who is seeing it and where it is spreading. And so I think the challenge is getting even greater as people embrace more privacy enhancing things, which is good, but that gives us, it makes it so much harder for us to understand what is spreading, how it is spreading, where it originated, and how many people are seeing things. And, a couple other challenges that I think are, specific to journalism. One is, as more of us do fact checking, as more of us dig into this world, we see more of the things that are false or misleading. And of course, our instinct is to call it out, which is a good thing, because for a long time, I saw in newsrooms, our default was, if we see something that's not true, we just ignore it, because we only want to report things that are true. But there's been an awakening that, well, actually, just because we saw something and we've decided to ignore it, we can't do that, because maybe millions of people have seen it because it's also on a social network. So we've had to reorient our approach to false and misleading or unverified information. But the challenge there is that we sometimes unintentionally give amplification and exposure to information that maybe actually hasn't reached that tipping point of people having seen it. And so now newsrooms have to decide not only, how do you verify, how do you dig into the information, but then we have to start making a calculation of, has it reached a level where we now need to engage with it publicly and debunk it, or do we risk actually spreading this falsehood, this misleading information in the act of trying to knock it down? And so you also then need to be grounded in psychological factors and other kinds of research around how people grab onto information and keeps with them. So much of this, I think, comes down to complexity of the environment, of the decisions that have to be made in newsrooms, of bringing in new tools and training, but also understanding the limits of these tools and training, and also understanding how we can unintentionally sometimes spread false or misleading information. I think all of those things are big challenges in this environment. And as has been said, the solutions are really whole of society solutions. Yes, education and media literacy play huge parts in it. Yes, potentially regulation or the behavior of the platforms, really important as well. But also thinking about some of the situations in society that create incentives for people to get into the business of manipulation, or get into the business of spreading falsehoods or scamming people online. And those come to fundamental issues around inequality and poverty. 4 years ago, I, along with Lawrence Alexander, did a story about young men and teens in North Macedonia who were running websites that were spreading false stories about the US election. And they didn't care about politics. They were in a country with very few economic opportunities, and they had managed to build some digital skills, and they applied those digital skills in a way that was earning them far more money than their parents had ever earned, sometimes in a month compared to what their parents might earn in a year or more of salary. And so the incentives around inequality and poverty, but also the opportunity that people see in many countries to build digital skills and make money, often creates a scenario where they see manipulation of information and social media platforms as actually their best economic opportunity. And that is something that we're going to need to address if we actually want to improve the information environment as well. And so with that, I'm happy to pass it to the next speaker.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to invite Olaf to put a poll question to our listeners and viewers. Olaf?
Yeah, thanks, Allan. And Craig made an excellent point, which perfectly fits between Craig and Janine, I guess. And if Danielle helps me out, we will see the poll now. So if, as Craig said, so if you see these kind of breaking news stories, and now the question is, of course, to everyone as the consumer, online consumer of online news, or if when you read this, actually, what's most important to you? And be honest, because it's tricky, I guess. So if you see this coverage, actually, what's most important to you? It needs to be fast. For instance, reports on hacked material, these kind of breaking news, whatever. Or so you want to be the first to know it, or it needs to be accurate. So you only want to know the full story and then engage. You want to engage with scrappy breaking news, or you're most interested in the origin of the information because you think, okay, that's a strange kind of breaking story. So where's it coming from? Or should it actually reflect your set of beliefs? Would you prefer to read stuff actually what you think actually is just proving your opinions, or you don't read news at all? So these are the options. A little bit complicated maybe, but so I think could be interesting. So I think the poll is still open. And shall we close it, Danielle? Okay, so here are what the audience in our Zoom room, and then again, so we are not representative here. So, but a huge majority of participants, 83% actually prefer to read accurate stories, and they will not engage in scrappy breaking news before they get the full story. I'm not really sure you're honest here, but that's exactly, so what's the challenge, I think, and I'm glad that we have Janine, because she's specialized on how journalists should run breaking news stories, and especially hacks and leaks. So thank you very much, and I give the floor back to you, Allan.
Thank you, Olaf, and may I introduce Janine Zacharia. Janine, over to you.
Thanks. Olaf, I'm only going to speak if after the pandemic I get to come to Denmark, okay? So that's a condition of this. I want to go. We'll take it on the road, okay?
Absolutely. The next Copenhagen Democracy Summit has a spot for you.
You know, I'm thinking, reflecting on what everybody said, when I started at Reuters in like the late 90s, and we were confronted with this. You know, it used to be timed against the AFP and the AP how fast we were with the headline. But the thing was, at that time, you had to be accurate. You had to get it correct, because if not, you were going to lose your job. There was a penalty. So now skip ahead 20 years or whatever it is more to where I teach at Stanford. And I start my class every quarter with this conundrum of speed versus accuracy. And I talk about all these pressures everybody's talking about to be first. But if you're wrong, there's a penalty. And so what we've lost, I think, now that everybody's a publisher, is that penalty. So I want to focus on that a little bit today. You know, one of the key challenges, I was asked to talk about the key challenges for journalists. I think I want to pick up on what Craig said. It really is, and what Lisbeth and Chine as well, about when to get in the game on this, right? When do you intervene to correct the record because of all the psychological factors that people want to, even if my friend Glenn Kessler at the Washington Post tells them a million times it's wrong, people who want to believe it are going to say, well, there must be a grain of truth there, right? So we need to standardize when that moment is. Is it when it gets 10,000 shares, 100,000 shares? I know the social media companies here in Silicon Valley, where I am, are trying to come up with the right number for when they will, you know, demote or whatever they do with their secret algorithm. How many shares is that? But that's a real problem. Let's take a step back for a minute, because there's a lot of blame to go around for the credible fact-based media the fake media, all these things. But we're living in an unprecedented time where you have a US president who has lied more than 22,000 times. This was all very new, right? So trying to figure out how to adjust. The White House press corps hasn't done a great job. They finally learned maybe on election night. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this is a new environment. So how much of this is going to improve once he's gone? Can we go back to a little bit of normalcy? Can we have some reason for hope? I don't know. I'm still very negative, but I want to hold out the possibility. Before the election, I was part of a disinformation working group at Stanford. This was psychologists, political scientists. I represented journalism. And my partner, Andy Grotto, who worked at the NSC in the White House on cybersecurity, we both said, if any of this is going to change, we need to come up with some standards for the fact-based, credible media on how to deal with it. I was very nervous before the election about a rerun of 2016 with the hack of the DNC, and how were journalists going to react? What did they learn from that? So Andy and I worked together for a while, and we came up, I put in the chat for those of you who can see it, some of these guidelines. The main recommendation was, if there was going to be some propaganda dump, some hack and leak, that the journalist, instead of running with the whatever John Podesta's risotto recipe was, or Hillary's speeches in New York, or whatever, they had to focus on the why. Who was behind this, okay? So I think we saw actually that the media, and I drilled with some of the top media on this in some, off the record kind of scenarios, they did pretty well if you look at the Hunter Biden dump. Now, it wasn't as dramatic necessarily as the DNC, hack, but they did pretty well. I think they brought that lens of, wait a minute, are we being manipulated here? I mean, it's pretty obvious with Rudy Giuliani and all that, but, they did a good job. And the Washington Post, actually, top editor, had distributed our recommendations and made clear that they were not going to tweet the information first. One of the things that you see in journalism Twitter is this rush to live tweet all the time. Why are they doing this? And I know that a lot of the major news organizations still haven't firmed up their social media rules, which I think there could be improvement. But I think we saw with Hunter Biden's story that they did pretty well. Now, during the election, which lasted several days, I think we saw also that a quite stark moment when the president went out on Thursday evening, I guess my time, and Thursday evening DC time, and he started giving that press conference where he was saying all these things that were very dangerous. It's been called the most dangerous presidential press conference in history. CNN stuck with it, but MSNBC cut away and all the networks cut away, okay, in the middle. This was a new thing for them. He's had plenty of times where he's been lying nonstop, right? But they decided to cut away. And they used the word lie, okay? And so suddenly there was this moment where they realized, wait a minute, this is exceptionally dangerous. And even Fox News, at least in their daytime programming, is now starting to treat him a little differently, at least acknowledging the reality that Biden is the president-elect. Now, in the aftermath, where are we? I think we're really struggling, right? The media doesn't know how to cover this moment of the interregnum, right? And so they're trying to even figure out what's going on. So what do we need to do? Well, a lot of people have repeated this, but my main focus here at Stanford now is how we're going to restore respect for credible fact-based news, because we're never getting out of this if we don't do that. And so to that end, I have some idea, like Craig said, media literacy is one part of it. Whatever we're doing is not working. My colleague Sam Weinberg in the Stanford School of Ed has showed that we're not doing any better now in 2020 that we were in 2016, despite some efforts to focus on this. I think that journalists have been demonized in the era of Trump, and it's going to take decades to reverse this, right? I mean, you don't have the president calling the media fake news and enemy of the people without any cost. So I'm wondering whether we can dispatch an army of journalists around the country and maybe around the world, in Paris and Denmark and all these places, to talk to people, to talk to them about journalism and ask them for story ideas and just recreate some kind of meetups so they see they're not enemies. Now, I, as a woman from Long Island, can't go and do this in Wyoming. It's not going to work, right? I need a Wyoming reporter to go into Wyoming and do this. So I really want to do something like that. I want to get access to credible fact-based media to people who hit paywalls. So I want to create some sort of, I don't know, this sounds a little hokey maybe, but buy a subscription for someone in a battleground state type thing so they don't hit the paywall on these things, sort of get them reading credible fact-based news. And then the main thing in terms of, you've got these conspiracy fake I mean, they're really like OAN, One American News Network, Newsmax that are growing, okay, and are going to supplant Fox the way Parler is replacing Twitter. And it's aggravating to me that you can have a reporter on Newsmax during the wildfires that are engulfing where I live, tweet out a map, okay? She tweeted out a map of, you know, the wildfires to her 250,000 followers. And she wrote, quote, "If the fires in Oregon and Washington are climate change, then why do the fires stop at the Canadian border?" Right? Sort of like a conspiracy, like, okay, it was a US federal data map. She had thousands of retweets of this, right? And whatever. I mean, there's got to be a penalty for on social media for people posting bunk. I rate every Uber driver, every Instacart delivery person, but anybody can go up. And so, Chine, we got to get like a rating system, right? Like if you post 30% of the time is true, that it's got to be indicated to people. So those are just a couple of my quick ideas, and I have so much more, but I can't wait for what remains of our discussion. Thanks.
What a fabulous series of presentations. Thank you, Janine. Thank you to all the panelists. Very thought-provoking. And rather than me asking questions, let's go to you, the questions you may have. Olaf, have you been tracking the questions?
Exactly. And as you said in the very beginning, so the main challenge will be that we have not enough time actually to discuss everything which came up here from the audience. So we have one participant who is wondering, and I think that question relates to what Craig said earlier, if social media got regulated as traditional media in the US. This is the entire debate about abolishing Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act. So give platforms liability for what they are doing and don't make them platforms but publisher. How would that affect traditional media? Could it be positive to establish joint norms of reporting, or could it also lead to social media taking over media reporting completely? So that's one question. The other question goes directly to Lisbeth, and as an audience member here, a participant is asking, how much do you see your readers being active on your fact-checking service, #TechDebt? So are people using this, and what kind of stories are people asking? And then we have a question from Nathaniel Monger via Facebook, who asked if it's a good idea if newsrooms consider having dedicated election desks, so especially in these high times of disinformation, to report on this, and could this mitigate the effects of disinformation? And maybe to Janine already answered this a little bit. What lessons can we learn from American elections, where the incumbent president was basically tweeting disinformation 24/7? And the question, I think, as you said, will this go away once Trump is history? So I leave it with that. There are more, but give it back to you, Allan.
Well, let's start with Lisbeth. There was a question specifically for you, Lisbeth. Would you care to answer that?
Yes, of course, and I would also like to comment on the regulation issue. But to be quite honest, I don't see enough, I would say, activity from our readers and from Danish people regarding, giving us links or whatever stories that we should fact check. I don't think that the engagement is really enough regarding what we see is going on out there. So most of our stories come from a thing that I didn't mention in my first presentation, that actually we, as many of the other fact checkers joining the IFCN network, we are all third-party fact checkers for Facebook. So we have a special access to looking at the Facebook and Instagram platform to follow what is shared and what is problematic things going on at the platform. And from that position, we can see a lot of the stories that we fact check and make our stories upon. So I hope that was answer to the question. I would like much more interaction with the Danish people when it comes to things they want us to fact check. Regarding regulation, just a short comment for me, because I think I wouldn't like Facebook and other of the social platforms to be more our censors at the internet. I don't like that idea. I think they do it a lot already. And just to tell you that we have a few weeks ago published a big survey in Denmark about regulation and freedom of expression. And the interesting thing here is that we introduce people to the same dilemmas as the Facebook moderators also have. And the Danish population was, you could say, cut half and half. Half of the people joining the survey was very much for freedom of expression, no censoring. The other half was, you know, we need to be more protective about hate speech and things we don't like to see at the internet. So I think it's a very problematic issue to go deeper into regulation when it comes to the tech giants.
Lisbeth, thank you. And let's go to the panelists in the order in which they spoke to respond to the questions. In your case, Janine actually posed a question directly to you. Would you care to answer that and perhaps comment on the other questions that are on the table?
Sure. So the question was about this idea of penalties, right, for bad reporting. Well, it's quite interesting, Janine, because you put it for individual users, right, on Twitter. So at NewsGuard, we rate websites. We rate full websites that are sometimes really small blog with just one person behind it, but sometimes more like sort of more big operations, whether they're reliable or not. It's what we do. So we look at the reporting and we rate the websites based on what they do, and very apolitical sort of consensual criteria, including do they report frequently false news, and false being outright false, and we are able to debunk it. So that's what we do for websites. And so when people share content from these websites, if they use our plugin, then they're aware that this is a dubious source. So why not go then to the next level of rating individual users? I think it's an interesting question. Of course, it raises a whole lot of questions, because if you are an individual Twitter user, then you're not really a publisher, like if you host a website. So it poses some ethical questions there, but I think it's an interesting thing to explore maybe. And when it comes to the other question that Lisbeth also responded to, related to Section 230 and to the platforms and whether or not they should moderate sort of preemptively, act as real publishers. I also don't think that, I mean, the question of Section 230 is one, but then there's this bigger question of whether or not they should act as real publisher and that they should moderate preemptively. I don't think that we should ask for that platforms moderate more in that sense and censor more, because we know, and we've seen it with QAnon especially, that the more you censor, the more you demote, the more you take down accounts and pages, the more you sort of feed those conspiracies. So in a way, it's not really helping the problem, it's sort of feeding it on the contrary. So that's why we at NewsGuard really value more media literacy, education, more context. And also going back to what I was saying in my presentation, I think we need more transparency. That cliche that freedom of speech is not freedom of reach, it's true. The problem is really with the algorithms of those platforms and the fact that we don't know what they're doing. We don't know exactly what they're demoting, what they're promoting, how the recommendation for groups is working. And so we need more transparency on that part, I think.
Chine, thank you. May I invite Craig to respond to the questions on the table, and just to add one other feature, concerned to know who are the most vulnerable out there? Who are you trying to protect when you're taking these measures to double check or to verify sources and accuracy of information? Craig, over to you.
Sure. Well, let me start with that one first. I mean, if we're talking about vulnerability to false and misleading information, to not being able to distinguish from reliable and unreliable sources in the information environment, you know, a lot of the data that I've seen is US specific. So let me put that caveat in saying this, but there's kind of a growing body of evidence to show that it is older Americans that do tend to struggle more with distinguishing, you know, the quality of information in this digital environment. And I don't think that we should imagine that everybody else is doing great, because I think everyone is struggling. It is a massive transformation that we have gone through in a very short period of time. And I think in a very basic mental and physical even sense, we haven't adapted to it yet. But the data does seem to show that people over 65 in the United States do have a more difficult time and have been the more prodigious sharers of kind of false and misleading information. And the reality is that a lot of the media literacy initiatives that have been put in place over the last 4 years, some pre-existed 2016, but with the awakening on this issue, there's been a lot of money rolling in, and a lot of them are focused on school-aged people, because you have a channel of delivery to reach students in classrooms. And that's great, because they need it too. But in terms of stuff that is specifically directed at older people, there is far less, and it's much harder to get at them. I mean, in the United States, the AARP is starting to try and put some programs together around this. They've been doing device literacy stuff for a long time, but there's a lot of work to be done. And just quickly on the sort of regulation question there, you know, it's not really feasible to have the platforms operate and have the same responsibilities as media outlets. They would basically have to shut down. You know, they would have to mediate every single thing being posted by every single person. But I think where there is some opportunity, and I will say also, you know, I'm very cautious about new laws and regulations, because I haven't seen a single good so-called fake news law yet. In fact, most of the ones that have been passed by authoritarian governments to criminalize dissent and criminalize independent media. And so we should always be careful of what we wish for. But where I think there's opportunity is in requiring these platforms to meet the standards that they say they are meeting. They say they have policies about certain kinds of content, and we don't have a meaningful way of understanding what kind of a job they're doing about it, because they self-report, and there's nothing that requires them to have a high degree of transparency and to open the books a little bit on what they're actually doing. And so, you know, that's where a lot of the reporting that I've been focused on is like, what happens when the rubber meets the road? What are they removing? What are they not removing? When they say that fact checkers are independent and get to assign strikes, and that pages will be penalized if they repeatedly share false information, you know, that's one thing, but we've found proof that Facebook is actually removing strikes at its own discretion without the fact checker's knowledge. So their adherence to the own program that they have set up is problematic. I would love to see stronger transparency and reporting measures, not these kind of buckets of smoke, these transparency reports they put out where they just cite lots of big numbers about all the content they removed, and we don't know what they've left up, and we don't know how good they are at identifying and actually delivering on these policies. So I think that's an area where potentially getting real reporting and real transparency would be very beneficial.
Thank you, Craig. Just building on your point, it's been observed by some that even if the social media platforms enforced the terms of their own user agreements, we'd be farther ahead. Janine, I invite you to respond to the questions on the table and make other closing comments.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm trying to think here how to respond to all these different things. You know, I mean, Craig brought up the point of older people. He's referring to, I believe, like the MIT study, and there were studies out of Princeton and NYU that show that older people tend to share more. But young people are really terrible at this too, in terms of discerning what's fake or real. Again, my colleague at Stanford, Sam Weinberg, recently ran a study, and he showed that more than half the students believe that a grainy video on Facebook of ballot stuffing provided, quote, strong evidence of voter fraud during the 2016 US primaries, even though the clips were actually shot in Russia. You know, more than 96% of them failed to recognize that a climate change denial group was connected to that posted something was connected to the fossil fuel industry. So I think that there's, you know, we need education all over the place. In terms of the social media companies, I mean, first of all, I mean, yes, Craig, yeah, maybe they'd have to shut down. Well, you know what? Maybe they'll have to, I mean, no one wants to say like what, you know, I mean, it's just, I think that the share button or the retweet button is a national security threat. It really is, because how are we going to slow down all of these things? Why do we need it? Right? I mean, and so, I mean, Twitter is trying to put, I think, pretty well some friction in where they say, do you want to read it first now? You know, like they're recognizing this problem. But they need to be responsible actors like you said. And I don't see, you know, the recommendation algorithm, when you read some of the data on like how bad the recommendation thing is, I mean, it's, you know, I mean, we have to stop talking about this as censorship versus whatever, you know, I mean, they need to figure this out themselves. There's no cost to them though, right? Because there is no regulation. They just make more and more money every day. So I think that's, those are issues too. And the other thing is, I think that, again, we need to focus internationally, urgently, about how to get people to realize the difference with all its foibles between the New York Times and Newsmax, between the PBS NewsHour and One American News Network. How are we going to reach these people? Because on balance, the credible fact-based media, with all their blind spots, with all their horrible live tweeting of Trump press conferences 5 years into this, they are the sources that are going to save us. And so we need to teach people the difference. How you teach a reluctant audience of 71 million Americans to tune into something else is the challenge of our day.
Janine, thank you very much. Let me go back to Olaf to see if he has other questions harvested from our viewers.
Yeah, we have, and of course we only have 3 minutes left, so therefore we try to be brief. One question comes from Jean Meserve, who's also a very well-known U.S. journalist. She's asking about the situation of local news outlets. And she's saying that in the U.S., but I could also confirm from a European side, actually, local news outlets are shrinking and dying. So the question is this a contribution to the distrust of media and the perception of a media elite? And how can we revitalize local news outlets and help them actually to get back to the people? The other one now, and now Chine already actually replied to a question here from a colleague at the foundation. Is so, as we talked about media literacy as a kind of a counter strategy, so are there good best practice examples you had seen so far which you could recommend and which could be kind of guiding models for others to also copy and spread the news? That were the two big questions we had here out.
Okay, those two questions. By the way, Jean Meserve is not only a distinguished journalist, she's also a member of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity.
Exactly. How could I forget this?
Let me then put to the four of you, the four panelists, just 30 seconds each because our time is running out. Any comments you have in response to the two questions that are now on the table, and any closing remarks you may wish to add. Over to you. We'll start with Lisbeth.
Thank you very much. I think it's, to be short, it's a real tragedy that the local news is dying because it means a lot for the close connection between serious professional media and people and their daily work. So in the Nordic countries, we have a tradition for state subsidies for media. And we also have that for local media, but even that isn't enough to save the majority of local media, I think, going forward. So it must be a political issue to take care of also supporting the local media, as well as an issue for people themselves in local areas. So I think the other closing remark I would like to make is that if we turn that so hard on the tech giants that they have to close, there will be just new platforms. See what's happening with Parler. See what's happening with the messenger way that people make groups and talk to each other. So if Facebook is closing, there will be a new Facebook, I think.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Chine, forgive me for the pressure of time that comes with the cruelty of the clock, but over to you for closing remarks.
No problem. Yeah, just on local media, I mean, we've seen what it does when they disappear. You've seen people fill that void in the US with sites masquerading as local outlets when they were really partisan websites, propaganda machines for political parties. So it's very important, and I see some initiatives to rebuild local websites, local media that are interesting. In France, for example, one local newspaper that has started having its editorial conference once a week in a cafe to invite people and to sort of rebuild that trust. I think those sorts of things are interesting. And when it comes to media literacy, I like that idea. I was answering that in the writing of inoculation, helping people, getting them a vaccine against misinformation. And some initiatives are interesting in that regard. There are some games. Someone from the Alliance of Democracies is citing a game. I had another name of a game. And I think what we're doing is also this sort of the same thing, inoculating people, helping them. The more they will view media literacy, the more they will read what makes a website reliable and what makes a website not reliable, the more they will be able to fight and resist misinformation themselves.
Thank you, Chine. Craig, closing remarks?
Yeah, the challenges faced by local media is I think absolutely a catastrophic unfolding crisis that is having far-reaching applications in society. You think about the accountability measure that independent journalism can have in small places around, the operation of local government, but also on a really basic level, for people in a community to know a local journalist, to see them out at events, to know them personally, to have their kids go to the same school. When people talk about, the media and criticize the media, of which there is a lot to criticize us for, I don't mean to demean that, but usually they're talking about large national faceless media. But then if you ask them about their local newspaper or a local journalist they know, they have a completely different point of view. And so if we don't have journalists in communities, then I think absolutely that trend of declining trust is going to accelerate. Potential local corruption and other things also have more opportunity. And so it is, if we talk about threats to democracy, I think it is legitimately, you can legitimately view the erosion of independent local media and their business model, which is what's driving the erosion, as a legitimate threat to democracy around the world. And it's something that I think needs to be treated with more urgency outside of just the insider media and journalism circles.
Thanks, Craig. Last word to you, Janine.
I just second everything Craig said and what Chine said and what Lisbeth said. They really summed it up really well. Buy a local subscription, buy 5 for your friends in a swing state or wherever in your own country, and donate to a local nonprofit journalism. And then we need to do PSAs about this, right? And get those real journalists who are the trusted intermediaries and trusted sources in front of the public, so we're no longer demonized.
What a privilege for me to be present for this discussion. I've learned so much listening to the 4 of you, informed and thoughtful perspectives on these difficult questions at a challenging time. We're grateful to each of you for the time you spent with us today. Thank you so much. And thank you to our participants who asked good questions. And over to you, Olaf. And again, thank you very much.
Yeah, I can just join you in thanking you. That was really an excellent webinar, and we never overpromised that this would be really chilling and exciting. So therefore, thank you again for joining us today. If you're more interested in our work at the Alliance of Democracies Foundation and the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity, please send us an email, visit the website. Of course, please follow us on all given social media platforms. We are in fact, are following these various things we talked about. So we're looking into how with fact-checking services we can improve open information ecosystem. We are also looking into if stronger legislation, since we have a close relationship to the policy communities we're trying to address to help on that side. We just invented a media literacy game, which you can find if you go into disinformation-diaries.org.
I think that Olaf's connection is
victim of a yeah, my internet connection is unstable. Yeah. Sorry. No, play our game. You will find it on the website. Don't forget to register for the 2nd Global Conference for Media Freedom next Monday. And we wish you all a pleasant weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olaf. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.